Taliban swept Kabul. Overnight, women found themselves banned from school with no way to work and help their families. With nothing to rely upon but their own courage and determination, these girls became breadwinners despite being banished from their own streets. From one dress, Kamala built a living room business that created a lifeline for women all around her neighborhood and offered hope and jobs at a desperate time. For me, the dressmaker is so powerful because it celebrates the unsung heroines who pull families through every day. Kamala's story pays tribute to their courage.
It is such a pleasure to join you. All of you are actually the reason why I left ABC News in 2004 to go to business school in a world I knew absolutely nothing about in the summer of 2004. Because while I had had this incredible career covering presidential politics and working at ABC News and CNN and CBS with some of the best people working in television news, I really felt like there was so much more out there. And that if you were committed to making a difference in some way, you had to keep asking yourself, what am I doing today that makes a difference that only I can do? So I asked myself that question, and I said, well, surely law school is the answer. So I went to visit law school, and I'm so sorry for the lawyers I'm about to offend, but I watched the students at the law school at Harvard play solitaire during parts of the professor's lecture, and I thought, okay, no, I can't take out student loans and play solitaire. I can't do that. So then I went to the Kennedy School, and the Kennedy School was doing incredible work in public policy and really thinking about innovative stuff, but it was so much of what I had been doing in public policy and covering presidential politics. So I said, well, I'm never going to go to business school. I don't know, I haven't taken math since high school, but I'm going to go over there and look. And what I noticed at the business school was there were so many people immediately who saw business as a force for change, as a way to make a difference in the world, as a path to not only doing good, but doing well, and to really bringing together people who were on the ground doing in very tough parts of the world with people in fancy places and fancy rooms who had power and water and roads and all of those kinds of things that are a luxury in so much of this world. So I spent the better part of a year taking finance classes and accounting courses and statistics, all these things I had not done since the Clinton White House probably, and decided to really focus on that and ended up going to business school in the summer of 2004. The summer of 2005, I worked at BP. I had a tremendous experience there, and then I flew to Rwanda. Because what had happened was I was looking for a topic to write about people who were on the ground creating change and using business to make a difference. Because one of the issues is that when we think of stories of war, we do not think of entrepreneurs. Stories of war are about people who go off and fight, and very rarely about the people who are left behind to rebuild their communities. And what I wanted to do was to show that business, far from being an afterthought in some of the toughest parts of the world, was actually central to the conversation of what people were doing and how they saw their futures. So I flew from London to Rwanda. All of my bosses at BP thought I was entirely insane. And when I got on the ground in Rwanda, I said, well, I want to do some stories for the Financial Times and some other places about small and medium businesses that women are owned, because what is the population you have left after conflict? Most of the time it's women. Rwanda, in the immediate aftermath of the genocide, was 77% female. If you talk to President Kagame and others, they would talk about using the population they had to make a difference to rebuilding their country. So I landed in Rwanda. I started talking to people at international institutions and said, I want to interview women who own small and medium enterprises. And my response was, we definitely do not have any of those. People would say, it's such a nice idea, Gayle, but if you want to talk to people running SMEs, small and mediums, they're not going to be women. There's a lady selling cheese on the side of the road you might want to talk to. She has a really good business. I buy cheese from her twice a week. And I said, that is incredibly important. But I didn't say I wanted to talk about micro-entrepreneurs. I said I wanted to talk about small and mediums, the kind of entrepreneurs and businesses that lift countries out of poverty and create hope and growth. And they said, well, that's so great, but we don't have any women doing that. So being a good reporter, that is the ultimate challenge, when people tell you something doesn't exist, right? Because one of the things I found almost immediately was the fact that when we think of stories of war, we don't think about entrepreneurs, and we certainly don't think about women, has a real investment consequence. Because you cannot count what you don't see, and you do not invest in things that are invisible. And so making those people, those entrepreneurs, visible became the challenge. And honestly, within 72 hours, not because I am a great detective, but because they are great entrepreneurs, I found a lot of women. And sure, some of them were doing very small businesses, including one who did have women who were making baskets, but they were making baskets that were sold at a small store called Macy's in New York City. Another woman I met very quickly was selling roses on the Amsterdam flower market, and another was exporting fruits and vegetables to Brussels twice a week. So I became inspired. I thought, gosh, there are these amazing stories out there and nobody's telling them. This was 2005. I called up the International Finance Corporation. I said, I see you're doing some work on entrepreneurs in conflict zones. I have this thing I want to write. And because it was so new, they said, okay, and we started working together on thinking about how do we tell stories that move people and show them that there are investable entrepreneurs in some of the toughest parts of the world, not despite the business environment, but because of the economies in which they're functioning. So that was the challenge. So I decided, I came back and the story ran in the Financial Times, and it actually ran on the day that the entrepreneur who has the basket company landed in New York City to renegotiate her contract with Macy's. So I thought, okay, that was fortuitous timing. That means you should keep going. And Harvard Business School said, where do you want to go next? And I said, well, I want to go to Afghanistan. Because if you're going to write about conflict zones and the toughest parts of the world, where else is business more important? So that all sounded incredibly good in Cambridge, and it sounded like a terrible idea by the time I reached the Kabul International Airport lobby after 38 hours of travel in clothing that could definitely stand by themselves. I landed in the airport and I realized it's actually very hard to keep a headscarf on and carry your luggage. All of these people around me are swanning, they're very good at it, and I'm barely making it down the stairs through customs and into the lobby, where I call Mohammed, my fixer, after waiting there for 2.5 hours and watching all of these families reunite and realizing I had no place to go. And I can honestly say it was the only time I've seen a British tank at an airport and felt vaguely reassured, because I felt like, if I'm still here in 2.5 days, I'll get them to take me to the embassy and I'll get a round ticket back. But I called, I paid the guy who was selling juice boxes in the little refreshment stand in the corner of the airport $5 US, and I said, can I borrow your cell phone? He said, yeah. He said, for $5 you can keep it for a little bit. And so I called Mohammed. And I said, Mohammed, this is Gayle, the American journalist. You were supposed to be here. I've been waiting. And he's very calm, and he said, Gayle, I've been here for several hours waiting for you, but because of suicide bombers, we can't get any closer to the airport than about 2 football fields away where I am waiting for you. So find one of the old guys with a silver cart, put your luggage on it, and meet me where I am in a blue Toyota Corolla. And that was really my first introduction to doing business, to functioning, to working in a place where your mortality is right in front of you all the time, and where grace is a fact of life, and where people not only show resilience every single day, but they show a resourcefulness that people could bottle and put in places that are fancy rooms, fancy places you could make a fortune. Because problem solving is a way of life. And what I found when I met Mohammed in the car was exactly what I found at Dulles Airport, which is, he said, Gayle, I'm so glad that you've come here, but we don't have any women entrepreneurs in Afghanistan. Didn't you know? Didn't you see what happened? The Taliban was here. I said, I get it. But let's see what we see. And being a good journalist and a great spirit, he said, okay, I'm with you. Let's go. When we started working our way down our list. And 2 days in, we landed in the very dark offices of Mercy Corps, which is an NGO based in Portland. And there was this young entrepreneur there who I was supposed to interview, who shocked me almost immediately, because as I came in, she had her Filofax on her desk, she had a whiteboard that she was working on, and she sat me down, gave me a cup of what I swear was Lipton tea, and said, Gayle, I'm so glad you're here. I want to tell you about this business I'm going to start. I want to start a consultancy that is going to teach entrepreneurship skills to men and women all around Afghanistan, and particularly to the young people, because nothing will help us stand on our own more than business. The foreigners will not be here forever, and we must take responsibility for our own futures. And she said, and business is even more important for women in a poor and traditional country like Afghanistan, because earning an income earns respect. And money is power for women, and that's even more true here in Afghanistan than I bet it is in your country. And I want to make a difference, not just for this generation, but for the next. And I sat there honestly stunned. I looked at her and I said, I'm just going to ask you a really indelicate question. I had made this decision to go to business school when I had just reached my 30th birthday. I knew she was younger than I had, and I had known from other people that she had never left her country, not during the Russians, not during the Taliban, not during her country's civil war, and now she was part of this young generation post-conflict, or what was sort of post-conflict. And I said, how do you know this much about business? How in the world do you sound like a candidate from The Apprentice when you've never left your landlocked country that has had 30 years straight of conflict? And she looked at me as if it were the most natural thing and said, oh, Gayle, I thought you knew. This is my third business. My first business I started under the Taliban. I was supposed to be a teacher, and the Taliban came, we couldn't do anything, and I started this dressmaking business in our living room. And that business was really good business because it created jobs for people all around our neighborhood at a time when there was nothing else. And that's really what made me an entrepreneur. And she paused and she said, you know, war brought us terrible things, but it also brought us opportunity. And I think that was the spirit that I became absolutely obsessed with as a storyteller. That out of desolation, these young people had created hope. Out of poverty and a really wrecked economy, they had found opportunity. And out of real economic collapse, they had managed to find a way forward, not just for themselves, but for people all around their neighborhood. So that's where I started. And what I found as I began this research was that in the 1996, as you saw in the video, the Taliban came through and absolutely immediately, overnight, changed the lives of young women just like those in your families. Young women who had gone to school, who had gone to libraries, who planned to be teachers and civil servants and doctors. And now the world began and ended in their living room. And for Kamala, it became even more serious very quickly because of the ethnic group that she was from. The Taliban was doing house-to-house searches looking for people who were fighting age. And that was men, 17 to 55. And so her father, and then the oldest of her two brothers, ended up leaving. And so you had a 19-year-old trained as a teacher, all of a sudden at the helm of a family of 5 brothers and sisters, and charged with finding a way to feed them. And I think so many times when we think of tough parts of the world, we do not think of business. And I would urge you, with all the creativity and the imagination that is in this room, you can make a difference. There are partners on the ground. There are entrepreneurs all over the place in even some of the most toughest parts of the world. And in fact, sometimes because of the fact that they're in the toughest parts of the world, with whom you could find a way to do business and do something that creates huge amounts of change on the ground. So Kamala looked around and thought, I have to figure out a way to feed my brothers and sisters. So she thought, okay, being a good entrepreneur without knowing it, what are my circumstances? Well, first of all, there's a market for cheap goods because all the rich people have left. So anything really cheap, handmade, people will buy because they can't buy anything else. They can't afford anything else, and all the wealthy have gone. The second thing was that, look, nobody wants to travel. They're not going to import goods anymore. So anything locally made, there's a market for. That's also positive. And the third thing that led her straight to dressmaking was the absolutely universal truth that no matter how bad things are in the world, women still want to look good. And that is as true in Taliban-era Afghanistan as it is in San Francisco 2015. You know, I would talk to young girls who would say, look, you go to these weddings, you go to these events, and you'd see the same people, and you didn't want to wear the same thing over and over again. And so there was a market for dresses. But there was one huge issue. Kamala had no idea how to sew, which is a problem when you're going to have a dressmaking business. Because like so many educated young women of her generation, she had never bothered to learn. She had always said, if I get married, I'm going to go to the department store and buy dresses. I'll get everything I need. I'm not going to waste my time learning to sew. And that was actually always my favorite part of the story because I failed 7th grade home economics. I actually was so bad with the sewing machine that they gave me cross stitch and said, please do this. So Kamala found, though, that even though she couldn't sew, she knew people who could, and one of them was her sister. And so she went to her sister, knocked on her door, and her sister said, there is no way I'm teaching you how to sew. Because some of you might have siblings who always have these great ideas, most of which turn out to be epically disastrous, or at least go absolutely nowhere. And for her sister, this was Kamala, right? The one with the big ideas who always came in with this great imagination. But the biggest thing she said no, reason why she said no, was because of safety. Because she looked at her, she said, do you see those guys out there on the streets? Because what came with the Taliban were vice and virtue forces who would drive around in Toyota Hilux pickup trucks looking for rule breakers. And that could be a woman whose wrist slipped out from under her burqa because she tried to take her child's hand, or a husband trying to help his wife onto a bicycle who was seen doing something indecent, or a 19-year-old boy who happened to be caught with a radio playing music. And they had AK-47s, and they had wooden batons, and they had radio antennas, and you did not know if you ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time where you would end up and with which weapon you would be suffering. So her sister was terrified, and Kamala said, okay, I know all of that, but we have to do business because we have to stay alive. And so eventually her sister relented, and honestly and truly, from that very first dress that they created together, and that eventually her sister helped to grow this business, they created a lifeline for families all around their neighborhood. Because what happened almost immediately was this, which was a reason for terror in the Taliban-era Afghanistan. Nobody wanted people knocking at your door, and especially if you were going to try to start a business with young women working. But what happened was, we talk about technology and the speed of information. There is no place where information travels faster than Afghanistan, through a very informal network of families and of cousins, friends, brothers, uncles, networks who come to life every single day in passing and swapping gossip. And what had happened was everybody heard there was somebody who had a job. And that was vital information because the economy had absolutely collapsed. It was one of the stories we don't talk about enough during war, I think, is just how desperate people become to support their families. I interviewed people who had sold baby dolls and shoelaces and their own doors and windows of their houses just to feed their children. So a business that was actually functioning, somebody who actually had work to offer, was a huge lifeline at a desperate time. And the moment that Kamala remembered she thought she had to grow her business was when Sarah John, one of her neighbors, friends, cousins, uncles, aunts, came and said, I hear you have work. She said, my name is Sarah John. I have never held a job in my entire life. My husband was a high school principal, and he had a heart attack a year ago and died, leaving me with 3 children. His brothers have been taking care of me, but all 3 have lost their jobs. One was a computer programmer working for the government. You can imagine the Taliban doesn't have a lot of use for him. Another was an airplane mechanic. The army has fled north. And the other was a civil servant, and they've stopped paying salaries. So I must work. She said, I have never held a job, but I promise you, if you hire me, you will not be sorry. And that moved Kamala, because as I think sure so many of you will recognize, her mantra inherited from her father was, you do as much as you can, for as many as you can, for as long as you can. And that is what moved her to keep growing her business. And what happened was she realized that even though she was never going to be a great seamstress, she was actually a pretty good entrepreneur. She understood how to go into the bazaar, how to stay safe, even with fights and virtue forces all around, how to find customers. And the other thing that happened was a girl came up to her one day at her house and said, Kamala John, my father says to tell you that he knows you're an honorable woman and that you have lots of rules in this house. He knows that men don't come here, that you only have people come at a certain time, so there are never too many young women here, and that you're only trying to support this community. And she said, he says, as long as you do that, he will do everything he can to protect you. And that's when she realizes the girl's father is part of the Taliban. Even they needed the income and were sending their kids to school. But as much as this story was about business and entrepreneurship and hope at a desperate time, it was also about community. Because these young people had been kicked out of every public space, their libraries, their classrooms, any offices, shops. If they were going to go anywhere, they had to go in a burqa with a male chaperone, and usually you tried to get off the streets as fast as possible. So in Kamala's living room, they would come together, these young women, and they would do all the things that young people do everywhere around the world. They would complain about their families. They would swap jokes. They would listen to music. And they would talk about the one cultural phenomenon the Taliban could never stop, which was the Titanic. Because Leonardo DiCaprio was far more popular in Taliban-era Afghanistan than he has ever been in San Francisco, California, or Los Angeles, or Denver, or London, or Romania, or any place else in the world. I mean, think about this. This was a city in which all forms of the human image were banned. Every Western import was banned. All film, doesn't matter where it came from, was banned. And yet there was no one who had not seen the story of Rose and Jack. I interviewed people who had smuggled in the bottom of their underwear packs from Pakistan through the border, passed it around to everybody in their neighborhood, old VHS dubs of Titanic, probably dubbed 17 times over, missing long pieces of the actual film. And they absolutely took over the culture of the time. There was Titanic wedding cake, Titanic bazaar, Titanic food bazaar, grocery, and my favorite was the Leo look haircut, which actually got 4 barbers sent to prison for giving young teen boys who came in and said, I want to look just like Jack. So life went on, and the truth was that things were very difficult, but it was business that got them through. And for me, as I tried to report this story years later, security was really probably one of the biggest challenges. I lived in this group house, which was a story that's much less G-rated and probably for another time, of aid that was this crazy mix of aid workers, and Australian, New Zealand, and British former army guys who were then working security. And they would always say, Gayle, you got to take close protection when you go in and do these interviews, right? You got to bring one of my guys with you. And I would look at them and say, I'm going into neighborhoods that have no foreigners, and I'm going in to ask people about what they did to work during the Taliban era. Well, I cannot show up with a guy with wraparounds and an AK. So we would compromise a different way. And Muhammad and I would go as low-key as possible. I'd wear huge black pants, black socks, black aerosols, and not the fancy kind you see in the commercials, but like the very granny kind. And then I would no makeup, a ponytail, and a jacket and a headscarf that I purchased at the Islamic clothing store in Anaheim, California. And when I would show up at these doors to interview young women who had now more or less moved on, to talk to them about what it was like to do business during some of the most difficult times in their lives, the inevitable answer to my greeting was disappointment. They would open the door and look for the foreigner and say, I thought an American was coming to interview me. And the first time I was so proud. I said, oh yes, don't I look just like one of you? And they said, no. I thought if a foreigner was going to come interview me and I said yes, Lindsay Lohan or Britney Spears or somebody like that would be at my front door, not sort of a dowdier version of myself. And that was an inevitable cause of disappointment, but it was done because the walls have ears and because you were trying to keep safe everybody who worked with you. One time I went to the UN offices to interview a woman who had been the only young person working in her family during the Taliban years, who had actually been the sole supporter of her elderly parents and another younger sibling during those years. And I went in and she said, "Oh, Gayle, nice to meet you, sit down. I just want you to know that if my husband finds out I've spoken to you, he will divorce me." And I froze. I said, "Well, that's economic suicide in a country like Afghanistan that is community-based." "Absolutely." I said, "You don't have to talk to me. We can just talk about what you're doing now at the UN." She smiled and said, "Oh, no, I think you've missed the point. I already agreed to talk to you. I simply want you to know the stakes of what this conversation is, because I want people to know how much work we did to keep our families afloat during those years, because the business stories, the stories of what we did, never get out." So all of that weighed on me, and I was very obsessed with the idea that no matter how bad security got, my responsibility was to be the eyes and ears and to bring to rooms like this, with all of you who have the power to make a difference, the stories of those who made a difference, not just for themselves, but for their neighborhoods at a time that looked absolutely lost of hope. So all of this were my lofty ideas, but security was awful. Within a 6-week period, the Ministry of Interior was bombed, the Ministry of Defense was bombed. 3 people were kidnapped that we knew, journalists who were working, and 2 foreigners were shot dead on the street, and countless Afghans that we knew were facing real security risk. And at the end of all of that, I finally got through most of my interviews, and Kamala came to me and said, "Gayle, I have great news." I said, "Oh." She said, "My brother wants to meet you." And my first thought was, oh no. Because for those of you who have ever worked in countries with a traditional structure, you know it only takes one unhappy brother's, cousin's, uncle's friend to say, "This is a terrible idea, what are you thinking? In case you didn't notice, security isn't so good now. The Taliban may or may not come back. Why would you let a story about your sister and her experiences during the Taliban years come out now?" So I wrote down this whole list of reasons that almost nobody put Taliban and women and entrepreneur and Afghanistan in the same story, let alone the same sentence. And that this was a story that was going to show the power of entrepreneurship. And I had all of these amazing ideas. And then he was 90 minutes late for our meeting. And by the time he showed up, my nerves were gone. Because all I could think of was all these years, I had gotten married and then immediately 3 days later gone on a honeymoon by myself to Afghanistan. And all of these conversations that you'd had, all of these people who had taken great risks to tell you their stories was all going to be lost. And she sat down and he said, "No, Gayle, I'm so sorry I'm late. It's election season, and because of the threat of suicide bombers, we haven't been able to get anywhere around the city in less than an hour, so I'm so sorry I'm late." And I said, "Oh, no problem. You know, what can I get you? Would you like some soda? Would you like some food? You know, anything I can do." And there was these bad Bollywood videos playing muted on the TV in the corner, which I will never forget. And all I could think of was, my career ends in this gray room. But he went on and said, "Gayle, I wanted to meet you because I wanted to thank you. And I wanted to thank you because my sister was so brave at such a difficult time. And she's a leader not only in my family, but in my community. And I always hoped a foreigner would come and tell her story." And I think at that moment he understood much, much better than I did why this story mattered. That there are unsung heroes and inspiring entrepreneurs all around us, showing resilience, grace, strength, courage in some of the most difficult environments. And almost never do we stop and say thank you. Almost never do we stop and salute them. Kamala's story is one small story of the power of one person to make a difference, not despite their circumstances, but because of them. And not despite adversity, but because of it. And I hope that that story, in this room full of people who can create change and who do make a difference every single day, will be one that continues to inspire you. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to join you.